The snow had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, and by 7, it had buried the city under a silence that felt almost sacred. Almost. Inside the Grand Meridian Hotel, the 42nd floor blazed against the dark sky like something that had decided the weather was beneath its concern. The Hartwell Foundation Gala had drawn every name that mattered in New York's financial and philanthropic circles, people who gave generously to good causes and expected, in return, to be reminded of their own generosity in rooms that smelled of hothouse lilies and aged Bordeaux, crystal chandeliers, string quartet, waitstaff in white gloves moving like ghosts between tables, and at the center of it, as she always was, Celeste Worthington Crane. She was 41, and she wore it like armor. The gown midnight blue, structured, designed to communicate that its wearer did not require the approval of anyone in this room, had cost more than most people's annual salaries. Her hair was pulled back into something architectural. Her jewelry was restrained to the point of aggression. She had learned, early in her marriage to Preston Crane, that in rooms like this, the loudest things were often the quietest. Preston was across the hall somewhere, working. That was what he called it. Working. Moving between tables with a hand on shoulders, a practiced laugh, a business card tucked smoothly into a breast pocket. The Crane Group was 4 days from closing a federal defense contract worth just under $1 billion. And tonight, the Hartwell Gala, attended by half the relevant decision-makers in the Northeast Corridor, was not a social engagement. It was the final movement of a very long symphony. Celeste understood this. She simply did not care. She was, at her core, a woman who had married well and had spent a decade and a half defending the perimeter of what that meant. She assessed rooms the way a general assessed terrain. She identified allies, threats, people beneath notice. The identifying of people beneath notice was a skill she had refined to something approaching art, which was why, when she first saw the man at table 14, something in her chest tightened with a particular species of irritation. He did not belong here. She was certain of it the moment she laid eyes on him. He was sitting alone at the far end of the table, a seat that had been assigned to a doctor, Harrington, who had apparently canceled last minute with his hands folded on the white tablecloth and his expression entirely, unnervingly calm. He was perhaps 38, 39. Dark hair going slightly gray at the temples. A jawline that could have been handsome if he had made any effort whatsoever to package it properly. But the suit. It was clean, yes, and it fit him reasonably well, but it was simply old. Not vintage, not a statement, just old, in the way that clothes go old when a man has more important things to spend money on. He was nursing a glass of water. Not even sparkling. Celeste's gaze traveled over him and then, because she was who she was, traveled back. He was watching the room with an attention that seemed wrong. Not the casual survey of a man who didn't know anyone. Something more deliberate. He watched people the way a watchmaker watches gears. She decided she would find out who had allowed him in. She moved across the room in the fluid, unhurried way of a woman who had never once rushed toward anything in public. She stopped at table 14. She looked down at him. He looked up, and his eyes gray, she noticed, steady as winter water, gave nothing away. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said. Her tone was perfectly pleasant and perfectly designed to communicate that she found this situation irregular. "Evan Marsh," he said. He did not stand. "Good evening, Celeste Crane. My husband's foundation hosts this event." She glanced at the empty seat beside him, and then back. "Are you someone's guest? I received an invitation directly." "From whom?" He smiled, and it was brief and not unkind. "From the Hartwell Foundation." "I believe the invitation said table 14, seat C." The smile was the problem. It was the smile of a man who was not nervous. Most men, when Celeste Crane looked at them the way she was looking at him, became nervous. They fidgeted. They elaborated. They explained themselves. This man had offered her 3 sentences and seemed to consider the matter closed. She studied him for one more beat. "This is a formal event. I'm aware, The dress code was specified on the invitation. A pause. He glanced down at his jacket briefly, then back up at her. I apologize if my suit isn't up to standard. I came directly from. I'm not asking for an explanation. Her voice dropped to something that was nearly warm, and was therefore colder. I'm simply curious how a man manages to attend an event of this caliber, without understanding that the way one presents oneself is a form of respect. For whom? I beg your pardon? Respect for whom? Evan Marsh said. And his voice was the same as it had been from the beginning, unhurried. The other guests? The room? You? Celeste's jaw tightened 1 millimeter. That was when her wine glass, which she had been holding loosely in her left hand, moved. She would later insist it was an accident that she had gestured, and he had somehow been in the way. The people at the adjacent tables would remember it differently. They would remember Celeste Worthington Crane standing very straight and tilting her wrist, and the dark red of a 2018 Bordeaux spilling down the front of Evan Marsh's white shirt and onto his jacket in one long, deliberate cascade. The string quartet continued playing. Celeste said, quietly, in the hush that had fallen over the surrounding tables. People like you ought to know where they stand. For a moment, 3 seconds, 4, nobody moved. Evan Marsh looked down at his shirt. He reached for his linen napkin. He pressed it against the stain with the methodical patience of someone who has spent time in situations that required methodical patience. Then he folded the napkin, set it on the table, and looked up at Celeste with an expression that, if you were watching closely, contained something that was not quite anger and not quite pity. He said, "Thank you. I think I've seen everything I needed to." He rose, nodded to the table at large, and walked toward the exit. Celeste watched him go. Her pulse had not changed. She was, she told herself, completely fine. She returned to her table, accepted a fresh glass from a passing waiter, and did not think about the way the man's eyes had looked when he said those words. I think I've seen everything I needed to. She would think about it later. But by then, it would be too late to matter. The morning had begun with coffee and catastrophe. The two things Preston Crane associated most strongly with marriage. He was in the kitchen of their Park Avenue apartment at 7:15 when his chief of staff, Angela Forsyth, called with the news that Senator Welling's office had asked for a second supplemental document regarding the Crane Group's ethics compliance record. The contract, $940 million, a 5-year defense infrastructure partnership with the Department of Strategic Procurement, had been moving through evaluation for 8 months. 8 months of site visits, background checks, capability demonstrations, financial audits, and meetings with people who wore American flag pins on their lapels and spoke about accountability while checking their watches. Preston had given the best years of his professional life to this contract. His team of 63 had restructured 3 divisions, hired 11 new compliance officers, and produced 4,200 pages of documentation. He was 52 years old, and this deal was either the crowning achievement of his career or evidence that he had spent a decade chasing a thing that would always remain just beyond reach. The supplemental is ready, Angela told him, delivered this morning. But Preston, Dr. Whitmore's office confirmed. Preston set down his coffee. He's coming tonight. His team confirmed the reservation yesterday afternoon, table 14. He closed his eyes for a moment. Dr. Evan Marsh Whitmore. He had been using the name professionally shortened to Evan Marsh for the past 3 years, a choice he'd made after returning from a stint advising the Kessler Commission on Infrastructure, Vulnerability, a choice, the profile in a defense trade publication had noted, he made partly for privacy, and partly because he had found, in his years of work, that the less people knew about who they were talking to, the more honestly they behaved. He was the lead civilian evaluator on the Strategic Infrastructure Partnership Program. His assessment, submitted to the Secretary's office, would constitute the single most influential recommendation in the contracting decision. He had no corporate ties, no political allegiances that anyone had been able to document. He drove a used Subaru. He had a daughter, 7 years old, whom he raised alone. He gave lectures at MIT on systems resilience, turned down speaking fees, and was reportedly impossible to impress. Preston had been briefed on Evan Marsh Whitmore 6 weeks ago by a defense industry consultant who who had worked with the man directly. The consultant's summary had been 4 words. "Do not underestimate him. He's evaluating us tonight," Preston said. "He's evaluating the culture, the tone. That's what the Kessler framework calls it, organizational character assessment. He'll spend the evening observing how the leadership team conducts themselves in an unstructured environment." Preston looked out the window at the snow beginning to gather on Park Avenue below. "Does Celeste know?" Angela hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. "I sent her the briefing document last week. The one that listed all guests of significance." Preston picked up his coffee again. It had gone cold. "She doesn't read briefing documents." "No," Angela said. "She doesn't." He had woken at 5:15 because Lily woke at 5:15. She was 7 years old and operated on some internal clock that predated electricity, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness and a way of standing in doorways that made her look, in the gray pre-dawn light, like something out of a painting Evan had once seen in the National Gallery. "Daddy, it's snowing." He looked at the ceiling. "I know, Bug. Is it a lot of snow?" "It's going to be." She climbed into the bed with the decisive competence of a person who has done this 10,000 times. She pulled the blanket over both of them and looked at the window, where the gray was just beginning to give way to the paler gray of morning. "Are you going to the party tonight?" "It's not a party. It's a work event. It's in a hotel," she said, with the tone of a 7-year-old who had heard this distinction before and found it unpersuasive. "Hotels have parties. Mrs. Delacroix is picking me up at 4. "I know. Will you be home late?" "Yes." "Okay." She considered this with the gravity she applied to most things. "Wear the navy jacket. The one from before." He looked at her. "It's nicer," she said simply. After he dropped her at school, walking the 6 blocks through the thickening snow, her hand in his, her purple backpack enormous on her small shoulders, he called the foundation and confirmed his attendance. He confirmed it under the name he always used for these things. Evan Marsh. No institutional affiliation listed. Guest of the foundation. He had done this kind of work for 11 years. The formal title was Lead Evaluation Officer, though the people whose organizations he evaluated rarely knew precisely what that meant until it was too late to matter. He had turned down a staff position at the department 3 times because he found that independence was the only tool that couldn't be corrupted by proximity to power. He didn't enjoy these evenings. He was not a man who thrived in ballrooms. He had learned to move through them professionally to hold a glass, to listen without appearing to listen, to make the small talk that gave people enough comfort to show themselves. He had read the full dossier on the Crane Group over the previous 6 days. The financials were clean. The compliance record was strong, arguably the strongest of the 5 finalists. Their technical capabilities on the infrastructure side were genuinely excellent. His colleague, Dr. Sandra Pierce, had completed the capability assessment and rated them top tier. But the Kessler framework, the evaluation model he had spent 4 years refining, and which the department had adopted, wasn't primarily interested in capability. Capability was table stakes. Any of the finalists could do the technical work. What the framework was interested in was something harder to quantify and far more predictive of long-term partnership success. Organizational character. How did the leadership treat people they didn't need to impress? How did the culture behave when it believed no one was keeping score? These questions could not be answered by documents. He arrived at the Grand Meridian at 7, checked his coat, found table 14, and sat down. He had been watching the room for approximately 40 minutes when the woman approached. Celeste Worthington Crane had not always been this way. If you had asked the people who knew her at 25, a sharp, funny graduate student in art history, who spent her weekends at flea markets and her evenings in arguments about Caravaggio, they would have described a woman who was nobody's satellite. The marriage had happened fast, and the money had happened faster, and the particular seduction of Park Avenue, which operated less like luxury and more like a gravitational field, had done its quiet and patient work over 15 years. What remained was a woman who had replaced warmth with precision, who measured every room she entered and every person in it against a private scale whose units were breeding, net worth, and institutional affiliation, who had never, in at least a decade, asked a stranger a question she didn't already know the answer to. She had clocked Evan Marsh from across the room at approximately 7:40 and had spent the next 20 minutes deciding what to do about him. Not because he was a threat, he was clearly no threat, but because his presence at table 14 represented a kind of anomaly she found personally offensive. Events like this had a grammar. People were supposed to be in the right places. Things were supposed to fit. He didn't fit. She had watched him speak with quiet ease to Senator Donovan Ashby, which was mildly surprising, because Donovan Ashby did not talk to people he didn't consider worth his time, and then again with Catherine Wells of the Hartwell Board, who had laughed at something he said, a real laugh, not the social kind. This annoyed Celeste in a way she could not have precisely articulated. She approached. He introduced himself as Evan Marsh. He did not elaborate. He answered her questions with the economy of someone who found elaboration unnecessary, and when she pressed, when she made the observation about the suit, which she delivered as a precision instrument, designed to establish the exact dimensions of the gap between where he was and where he should not be, he had not flinched. He had turned it around. Respect for whom? 3 words. She replayed them in the back of her mind for the next 4 hours, beneath every other conversation she had, beneath the champagne and the dessert course and the speeches. 3 words spoken in a tone so free of heat that their sharpness had taken a full 10 seconds to register. She had not planned the wine. That was almost true. She had gestured that part was accurate, but there was a moment, a fraction of a moment, between the gesture and the tilt, when she had made a choice. She could feel the ghost of it even now, the way one feels the ghost of a door closing after the sound has already gone. She would not apologize. She had never once, in the entire arc of her adult life, apologized for letting someone know where they stood. The thing about truly consequential decisions is that they are rarely announced. Evan Marsh walked out of the Grand Meridian at 8:52 p.m. He collected his coat. He stood for a moment in the revolving door, watching the snow, which had built to something serious now, deep and soft and indifferent to everything that had just happened on the 42nd floor. He texted his babysitter, running a bit late, all fine. Then he stood in the cold for another minute, breathing it in. He had been poured wine on before. Not literally wine, he thought, with a gray kind of humor, that this was actually a first, but the experience of being assessed and found wanting by someone with a great deal of money and very little else was not new to him. He had grown up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, where his father had run an auto repair shop, and his mother had taught elementary school, and the first time he had entered a room full of people who divided the world into people like them and everyone else. He had been 19. He had a clearer memory of it than of most other things. What he had learned, over the 20 years since, was that the most useful information he ever collected was never in the documents. He flagged a cab. He sat in the back and opened his evaluation notebook on his phone, a private, encrypted app he used for field observations. He typed for 3 minutes. Then he closed the app and watched the city go by in the snow, the yellow lights and the black trees and the silence beneath the sound of traffic. He thought about Lily, asleep by now in Mrs. Delacroix's guest room. He thought about the way she had looked at him over breakfast, deciding about the jacket with the seriousness of a small person who knew that the way you showed up to things mattered. He thought about the woman on the 42nd floor, about the particular quality of her contempt, the way it had been so practiced, so refined, so completely unconscious of itself, and about what that said about the organization whose values she helped define. By the time he reached home, he knew what he was going to write. Let us go back, because the moment itself, the wine, the words, the 42nd floor deserves to be seen clearly. The string quartet had been playing the first movement of something Haydn-ish, clean, and measured. The room was at peak density, the sound of 200 conversations, creating a kind of white noise that made Celeste's voice carry less far than she intended. She approached the table with the particular walk of a woman who had a purpose she would not name. She stopped before him. She looked down. She said, when she reached the point of no return, "People like you ought to know where they stand." The thing about those words, the thing she did not understand and could not have understood at that moment, was that they were not an insult delivered to a stranger. They were a policy statement. They were the concentrated essence of a way of seeing the world that had saturated the culture of the Crane Group from its uppermost floors to its basement parking garage. The Worthington Crane ethos, as documented over 11 years of partnership agreements and vendor relationships and employee exit interviews that Evan had read with considerable care, was one of tiered respect. You were excellent to the people who could help you. You were civil to the people who were watching. And to everyone else, the server refilling your water glass, the assistant who scheduled your calls, the man in the old suit who had showed up to an event uninvited in the eyes of no one but you were honest, in the way that only the truly powerful ever feel licensed to be honest. What Celeste Worthington Crane had said to Evan Marsh was not unusual behavior for her. That was precisely the problem. The wine fell slowly, because expensive wine always seems to fall slowly, catching the light of the chandeliers as it went. It hit his shirt and spread. He reached for the napkin. He pressed it against the stain. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "I think I've seen everything I needed to." There was, on his face, something that Senator Ashby, who had watched the entire exchange from 4 feet away and would say nothing to anyone for the next 6 hours, would later describe as the expression of a man who had been conducting a test and had just received the final data point. Not anger. Not humiliation. Something more like completion. The nearest waiter, a young man named Christopher Stahl, who had been working events at the Grand Meridian for 2 years, and who had witnessed, in that time, more small cruelties than he could count, saw Evan Marsh stand, fold the napkin, and walk out. He watched him go with the particular exhausted admiration of someone who had never once been able to do the same thing. The morning after the gala, Preston Crane woke at 6:15 to find 3 missed calls from Angela, and 1 text that read, "Call me before you read anything." He was in his study with the door closed by 6:23. "Tell me," he said. Angela, who had been awake since 4, said, "The Observer at table 14 last night. Evan Marsh." His full name is Dr. Evan Marsh Whitmore. He's the lead civilian evaluator on the SIP contract. Silence. "Preston, I heard you." Celeste, apparently. I know what Celeste, apparently. He had seen Christopher Stahl at the exit, and Christopher Stahl, who was young and not yet schooled in discretion, had described what he'd witnessed with a server's comprehensive eye for detail. Who else knows? As of this morning? Nothing public. But Catherine Wells, at the Hartwell Foundation, saw it. Donovan Ashby was 3 feet away. Preston sat down. He was a man who had spent 30 years building something from almost nothing, a regional infrastructure consultancy, grown into a 60-person firm competing for federal contracts, and he was not, in his private moments, incapable of clear-eyed self-assessment. He knew what his wife was. He had known it for years, in the way you know things you have decided not to address because addressing them would require a confrontation with your own choices. He said, "Can we reach Whitmore?" "Not directly. Protocol prohibits any contact between an evaluating officer and a contracting party during active review. Any attempted contact would be disqualifying." He closed his eyes. "Okay. His final report is due in 4 days. 4 days." Preston sat with the number. 4 days between himself and either the culmination of everything he had worked for, or a very quiet, very final door closing. "Get me Senator Ashby's office," he said. "And get me our legal team. And Angela." He paused. "Don't tell Celeste anything yet." The Defense Trade publication had published the profile under the title, "The Man Who Changed How the Pentagon Buys Trust." Evan had read it once, found it marginally embarrassing, and had not thought about it since. But the facts were accurate. He had graduated top of his class from Carnegie Mellon in systems engineering at 22, spent 5 years as a signals intelligence officer in the Army, left with the rank of captain after his wife's diagnosis, and spent the following 3 years in the specific, grinding fog of loving someone who was dying, while also trying to be a competent father to a child, too young to understand what was happening. Clara had died when Lily was 14 months old. The thing about grief, Evan had found, was not that it passed. It was that you grew around it. and the growing changed the shape of you. And eventually the shape you'd grown into was simply who you were. He was a man who had stood at the edge of an enormous loss and discovered that what remained, afterward, was a very clear sense of what mattered. He went back to school. He did his doctorate in organizational risk assessment. He wrote a framework, the Kessler framework, named for the professor who had supervised his dissertation that proposed a different model of institutional evaluation, one that treated character as a measurable variable, rather than a soft afterthought. The Department of Defense had adopted a version of it in 2021. He drove a 7-year-old Subaru. He owned a 3-bedroom house in Rockville, Maryland. He paid Mrs. Delacroix $40 an hour to watch Lily when he traveled. And Mrs. Delacroix, who was 63 and had raised 4 children and was as wise as any person Evan had ever met, accepted this and made Lily pancakes in the shape of animals. He wore the navy jacket Lily had selected, and he had shown up to the Grand Meridian Hotel, and he had sat at table 14, and for 90 minutes he had watched. He had seen Preston Crane work the room with the cheerful, practiced energy of a man who was very good at seeming warm. He had noted that the senior vice president, a man named Douglas Fitch, spoke to the service staff with quiet, automatic courtesy. He had observed the general tenor of the leadership table, the easy laughter, the genuine curiosity, the culture that a company either has or doesn't have, that accumulates over years and shows itself, always, in exactly these kinds of unguarded moments. He had been, until 8:31 p.m., inclined toward a favorable recommendation. The Crane Group's offices occupied floors 31 through 34 of a building on 6th Avenue. Preston Crane had stood at these windows, in the years of building the company, and watched the city, and believed that if you worked hard enough and built something honest enough, the work would ultimately speak for itself. On the second morning after the gala, at 9:15 a.m., he received a call, not from Evan Marsh Whitmore, from the office of the Deputy Undersecretary for Strategic Acquisitions. The formal notification was brief. The SIPP contract review process had been completed. A final recommendation had been submitted. The Crane Group had not been selected. The letter arrived 2 hours later, and it was 3 paragraphs, and it said nothing specific, as these letters never do. It cited evaluation criteria and comprehensive assessment and the needs of the program at this time. Preston stood at his window for a long time after reading it. Douglas Fitch appeared at his door at 11. He was 60, had been with the company for 12 years, and had the face of a man who had delivered bad news before and knew how to stand while it settled. "The board is going to ask about next steps," Douglas said. "I know. There are other contracts on the horizon. The Meridian Infrastructure Project. I know." Preston looked at the window. The snow had stopped overnight, and the city was white and clean and entirely indifferent. "This one's gone, Doug." Douglas nodded. "Tell me something," Preston said. "Honestly, the Hartwell board. The partners. The people who were in that room Tuesday night." He turned. How many of them were watching? Douglas considered this for a moment. Most of them. And Celeste. How does she present to them? To the people who matter to us. Another careful pause. "She's formidable," Douglas said, which was the most diplomatic word Preston had heard in 48 hours. "That's a very diplomatic word." "Preston, no. I want to hear it." "What do they see when they look at her?" Douglas said. "In the way of a man choosing honesty, because kindness had run its course. They see someone who has no interest in anyone she can't use. And they see that you've decided, that's fine." He let the silence sit for a moment. It wasn't fine on Tuesday night. Evan Marsh Whitmore submitted his evaluation at 11:47 p.m. on the Wednesday following the gala. The report was 43 pages. The executive summary was 8 paragraphs. The relevant passage, the one that the Deputy Undersecretary would mark with a pen and reference in a subsequent memo, read, "The Crane Group's technical capability profile is strong, and, on capability metrics alone, would merit recommendation. However, the Kessler framework evaluates organizational character as a primary determinant of long-term partnership suitability. During observation at the Hartwell Foundation Gala, evaluator witnessed conduct by senior leadership that reflects a systemic organizational culture in which value is assigned to individuals based on perceived social status rather than merit or dignity. This is not an isolated behavioral incident. It is consistent with patterns identified in vendor, relationship records, exit interview data, and internal communications reviewed as part of this evaluation. Organizations that operate on tiered respect, treating those with perceived power with greater regard than those without, carry structural fragility that tends to manifest, in the middle term, as procurement irregularities, stakeholder alienation, and partner attrition. On these grounds, the evaluator's recommendation is negative. He filed the report. He closed his laptop. He went down the hall to check on Lily, who was asleep in the specific compact way she slept, one fist under her chin, the blanket thrown sideways, her breathing even and slow. He stood in her doorway for a minute. Then he went back to the kitchen, made himself a cup of tea, and sat at the table in the quiet house, while the snow outside finished falling. The winter went on. There were consequences for the Crane Group, as there always are when something large falls. The board met in emergency session the Friday after the contract loss. The loss itself could be absorbed. The firm had other revenue, other partnerships. What could not be absorbed as easily was the conversation that Senator Ashby had in the week following the gala, with two members of the board's oversight committee, a conversation that began with Ashby's gentle, precise account of what he had witnessed at Table 14 and expanded, over 2 hours, into a broader discussion of organizational culture and who, exactly, had been setting its tone. Celeste resigned from the board of the Crane Group Foundation in January. The language was mutual and bloodless, as these things always are in writing. In practice, Preston had spent 3 evenings in his study with a financial advisor and a family attorney, working through what a formal separation of their professional lives would require. It was, as these processes always are, more complicated than it looked from the outside, and less surprising than either of them would admit. She did not apologize to Evan Marsh Whitmore. She would not have known how to find him, and even if she had, the architecture of her self-regard had not yet developed a door for that kind of thing to walk through. She told herself, as she had told herself since Tuesday night, that she had done nothing wrong, that the man had been out of place, that the loss of the contract was an overreaction to a minor social incident. She almost believed it. Preston believed it less. In March, Preston Crane drove to Washington for a conference on federal infrastructure procurement. He did not have any particular expectations of the day. He sat in the back of the morning session and listened to a panel on evaluation methodology, and the third panelist speaking from notes, without slides, with the particular calm of someone who has no need to perform confidence, because they simply have. It was Dr. Evan Marsh Whitmore. He listened for 45 minutes. He did not approach during the break. He did not approach after the session. He sat in his seat when the room emptied, and he thought about the 4 words the man had said on the 42nd floor of the Grand Meridian Hotel. In the quiet, after the wine had fallen. "I've seen everything I needed to." He thought about his father, who had built bridges, literal ones, in the civil engineering sense, and who had told him once that the difference between a bridge that holds and one that fails was never the load it was designed for, but the load it hadn't anticipated. The unexpected stress, his father had said. That's where you find out what the structure is really made of. He thought about what the unexpected stress had revealed about the Crane Group structure. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked out into the Washington spring. 6 weeks later, he sent a letter. Not to Evan Marsh Whitmore, there was no appropriate channel for that. He sent it to the Ethics Review Board of his own firm, copied to the board's oversight committee, marked for the record. It was 3 pages. It documented, in the language of institutional self-assessment, a structural failure of organizational culture that he had allowed to persist for too long. It proposed a governance reform. It named no individuals. It did not read like a man performing contrition. It read like a man who had sat with a very cold fact for a long winter and had decided, finally, to do something useful with it. Douglas Fitch read the letter in his office, alone, and then read it again. He thought it was probably the best thing Preston had ever written. Evan Marsh Whitmore drove Lily to school on the first warm morning of April, the windows down, the radio off, the air carrying that particular quality of early spring that always seemed, every year, slightly miraculous. Lily was telling him about a project she was working on, something about plants and how they found the sun, and she was explaining it with the specific intensity of a 7-year-old who has discovered a fact about the world that feels personally important. They don't actually move, she said. They just grow toward the light. The cells on the dark side get bigger, and that's what makes them turn. Is that so? Mrs. Alterman says it's called phototropism. She said the word carefully, the way she said all long words, as if tasting each syllable. Evan drove. The light at the intersection was red, and the city was doing what cities do in spring, waking up, opening, expanding into the warmth with something like gratitude. Daddy, yeah, Bug, why do plants grow toward the light? He thought about this for a moment. In the genuine way she expected him to think about things she asked him. Because that's where the energy is, he said. They need it to live. She considered this. Is that what we do too? More or less, he said. The light turned green. He drove. There is a version of this story that would, at this point, arrive at a lesson. Something about the dangers of arrogance, or the invisibility of judgment, or the way that power insulates itself from accountability until the moment it cannot. These things are all true, and they are all present in what happened between October and March in the lives of these particular people. But the actual end is quieter than that. It is a man driving his daughter to school on a warm morning, the windows down. It is a child discovering that growth and light-seeking are, on some fundamental level, the same thing. It is the understanding, available to anyone who wants it, and to no one who doesn't, that the way you treat the person in the old suit at table 14 when you believe there are no consequences, when you are certain of your own position and dismissive of his, is not a minor thing. It is not a lapse. It is a diagnostic. It tells you, and anyone watching carefully enough, exactly what kind of structure you have built, whether it will hold, or whether, under the right unexpected stress, it will simply come apart.